Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another Survivor ranking video. This time I'll be ranking every player that was voted out and returned to the game. Which with Survivor there aren't too many examples here, with there only being 6 seasons at this point that even offered that opportunity at 2 different points of the game for each of them, with one season in particular having the same returnee at both opportunities, meaning that there are 11 players to be ranking here. Now we'll be ranking these players based on how I feel like they played on the season that they end up returning to the game, not based on how they are as players in the grand scheme of Survivor, as that would be a completely radically different list. So for this list, we will be talking about 2 people from Survivor Pearl Island, 2 people from Survivor Redemption Island, 1 person from Survivor South Pacific, 2 people from Survivor Blood vs. Water, 2 people from Edge of Extinction, and 2 people from Winners at War. Let's get started. At number 11, the bottom of the list here, the worst player to be voted out on a season and come back in that same season is Matt Elrod from Redemption Island. And Matt, I think just plays a pretty bad game. He's someone that is blindsided at his second tribal, after having been part of the Francesca vote, though blindsided by his own alliance the second time around, only then come back to the game and decide to work with that alliance once again, while also considering working with the other side and making his own alliance aware of that, to the point where Austin Rob organizes blindside on him once again. And it is a really bad game. Now, I think the one benefit to all this is the fact that he does survive 1 round of gameplay without some sort of immunity, which cannot even be said for the next person that we'll be talking about. However, I think there's a couple things that knock Matt further down. The fact that he does get voted out twice, as opposed to the other person who only gets voted out once, but also the fact that I think he's a lot more at fault for his boots, especially the second time around, where that is entirely due to his own sloppy play, and because that Matt Elrod was solidly at the bottom of this list. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a person that I've been open in saying that I think this person played a really terrible game on this specific season, and that person is Natalie Anderson from Survivor Winners at War. And again, Natalie Anderson, I think plays the worst runner-up game in Survivor history. She's literally voted out first and spends the entire game on the edge of extinction, only to come back at the very end and not even then survive a single round of gameplay without having some sort of immunity, playing idols at both the final 5 and final 6 rounds, while also winning immunity at the final 4, not really making a single correct move the entire time. She's really tricked by Sarah into keeping her around at the final 6 in a situation where Sarah was a much bigger jury threat to her at the end than someone like Denise, while also at the final 5 round, the only reason she's successful in voting out Ben is because Ben decides to lay down his sword for Sarah, something that was obviously completely out of Natalie's control. And then in the final 4 round, she completely wastes an opportunity there. After having just seen Chris Underwood throw himself into fire and take down the biggest threat in Rick Devins, she doesn't do that against Tony, which I think loses her most of the respect that she had left from a lot of the more game-focused people on the jury. Now, I will say I don't think she does that much wrong during her actual boot round. I think she could have handled the overall vote better. I do think she was kind of just naturally in a bad position due to the fact that she had this pregame relationship with Jeremy. But I think this is a situation where, to me, she pretty much plays the worst possible game she could have played to get to the end. And because that, for me, she is still here at number 10. At number 9, we're moving on to someone that did at least survive a couple more rounds of gameplay, but still not an impressive game at all. And that person is Laura Moret from Survivor Blood vs. Water. Now, Laura's a player, I think in Samoa, she plays a pretty solid game. However, I do think Blood vs. Water really exemplifies all of her faults, where right away she seems to be on the bottom of the original returnee tribe and seems to put all of her trust in Aris, only for Aris to then lead the vote against her and getting her taken out at the first time that her tribe goes to an official tribal, being taken out over the likes of Alora B, which I think is pretty bad. Now, she's obviously very strong in Redemption Island duels, and through that returns to the game, and through that does end up being in the majority, sides with Tyson's alliance and blindsiding Aris, and proceeds to be in the majority for the next couple rounds, though again, she's always on the bottom of that alliance. And for her to be taken out in a situation where it was really almost no one's best interest to actually be taking out Ormret in that position, I think is pretty bad, where she gets taken out in a final 8 vote, where really there are these 2 opposing sides for the following round that could have easily used that round and used Laura Moret as a number to take control of the game, but instead they all decide to vote out Laura Moret first and take that battle to the following round. Also, a situation where Sierra ends up voting out her own mom here, to where again it's not necessarily a a complete fault, though I do think it's indicative of the fact that she wasn't going that much out of her way to save Laura in this position. And Laura just overall, to me, again, like, doesn't play that good of a game. I mean, in comparison to someone like a Natalie, they're both voted out the first opportunity. And to be honest, I think Laura probably does more wrong than Natalie in that first boot round. And really, I think she probably does more wrong than Natalie in her boot round there. But then unlike Natalie, again, she does survive some rounds without some sort of immunity, but again, it's still not overly impressive. Still taken out during the mid-merge phase of the game, because that for me, she's here number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that I think is probably one of the toughest people to rank here. Someone that was voted out of the game 3 times and came back to the game twice, and that person is Ozzy from Survivor South Pacific. And again, I think this game is very tough to assess. That is one that Ozzy essentially weaponized Redemption Island. To where, while yes, I don't think he gets anywhere close to the end had Redemption Island not been in place, I do think he really utilizes a twist to the best of his advantage. Again, sending himself to Redemption Island, a position that to him he was guaranteeing that his tribe would come into the merge with numbers. Also, the second time around, really playing up to the jury on their way out while on Redemption Island. That made him a guarantee to win had he gotten to the end at that point. He does win his way back, to where, while yes, he does essentially get taken out the first opportunity there once again, he is obviously extremely close to a near unanimous win in a jury vote. And the fact that he was so close to an actual win, which none of the previous 3 that we've talked about were, is something to hype him up here. However, at the same time, his game is still extremely rocky. I mean, both times he's voted after the merge, he's essentially voted out the first opportunity, while in the pre-merge, while he still isn't technically voted out, he's still not even necessarily that well positioned there. So while he's in the numbers early on, he eventually gets blindsided when Elise goes home, and really, I don't see any long-term prospects for him either way. So I think that's really what makes this really tough, in the sense that, like, in a way, I think you can argue that he should be higher on this list because he was technically not even voted out that first time. However, even then, even when just assessing him being voted out the second time around and coming back, it's still a game where he's entirely reliant on completely winning out, which is why I can't rate him too much higher here than number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that I also had a tough time assessing, but kind of for a different reason, and that person ends up being Tyson from Survivor Winners at War. And again, Tyson played a very rocky game on this season as well, where obviously he really struggles on his original tribe, kind of being on the bottom and just barely surviving until his eventual vote off, in a position where it did seem like he did some pretty poor campaigning that eventually led to his vote off as well. Now, again, I think most of it comes from the massive target that was on his back beforehand, but it doesn't feel like he played into that well. But then he returns to the game, and I actually do think he plays solidly after he returns to the game. He's able to find himself in a majority alliance for the next few rounds, and while I think he does probably waste some opportunities there, to where I think him, Kim, and Jeremy really could have tried to keep more of their numbers around and tried to flip the game on the Tony contingent of things, I still don't think he plays particularly poorly, especially considering his actual boot round is a very wonky one where he wasn't even supposed to be targeted until Jeremy plays his safety without power, and even in that position, he comes extremely close to being saved by an idol, essentially being a coin flip over who Kim would have played it on. And I do feel like his boot round there was extremely wonky, and I think overall I just come out of Tyson's Winners at War game feeling like he actually had some agency at a point in the game, unlike Ozzy, who even before he was voted out the first time had already been blindsided and was on the bottom and was never able to get any of that agency back, while I feel like Tyson was able to recover for a bit. So again, I do feel like Tyson's an edge above Ozzy, even though I don't think his win equity was Ozzy nearly as high, but because of that, for me, he's here number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a player that's kind of a mix of Ozzy and Tyson. Someone that did have a decent amount of win equity by the end. They also did have more points where they were in the majority, and that person is Tina from Survivor Blood vs. Water. Now, Tina played a game where, again, she was in a decent spot early on. She did seem to be within the core majority alliance on the original returning tribe. Then after the swap, she seemed to be essentially running things alongside Katie and Monica, and was able to pull in Vetus, so I knew something that's due to pregame. Though, again, at the merge, she ends up getting blindsided at the RS vote, and then ends up being taken out not too long afterwards, to where she shockingly returns from Redemption Island, and is able to genuinely survive the Sierra boot round, only to then fall just short. Again, I do think the first half of her game is probably better than any of the people that we've talked about so far. I mean, she's the only person that we've talked about so far that actually survived the entire pre-merge phase of the game. Though again, the Ozzy one's a bit rocky, but even then, Tina remained a majority throughout the entirety of it. And while she's booted not too long afterwards, again, she comes back with a decent amount of win equity. A position where she has 3 completely locked in jury votes in Katie, Vetus, and Aris, a very likely vote in Laura, which is already half the jury. jury. Now, I do think against Tyson, I do think it's extremely close to where I would actually lean towards Tyson, particularly with Sierra siding with Tyson over Tina, though I do think if it's a situation where she's able to take out Tyson at 4, which is not out of the realm of possibility, and I do think she does have a decent chance against Monica and Jervis. So again, I do think the win equity was there. Again, not as much as someone like an Ozzy, but I think most of the rest of her game was better than Ozzy. So again, I feel like she is essentially like a mix of Ozzy and Tyson, and because for me, she's above them at number 6. At number 5, we're moving on to a player that I had a tough time assessing, largely because this is the person that actually goes the furthest out of anyone eligible on this list before being voted out, though is also a person that had almost no win equity in the end, and that person is Andrea from Survivor Redemption Island. Now again, Andrea makes it very far into the game before being voted out. She's at the final 6 during her vote out and comes back at the final 5, to where she then gets voted out immediately afterwards in a situation where she's kind of screwed over by the fact that Boston Rob has an idol. So because there's no incentive for Ashley or Natalie to flip, though in reality I don't think Natalie would have flipped anyway. But still, it's like, I think when you look at it from that lens, she does seem like a very decent player on this list, one that probably should be relatively high. However, I've always had issues with Andrea's Redemption Island game, particularly in the fact that, again, she's a bit too passive and her letting a Boston Rob to run things, where I do think for the likes of like a Grant and an Ashley, there's at least like reason to let Boston Rob run things. Again, Ashley comes one round away from potentially winning the game, even over a Boston Rob, while Grant's another one that just probably outright beats Boston Rob in the end. Andrea is not that. Like, Andrea is someone that was not very well respected by the jury. As we see when she goes on Redemption Island, she was essentially shunned when she got there, largely because of how upset the jury was at her and blaming her for the way that the game turned out, with her having flipped on Matt at the merge. And because I don't really see the jury being willing to vote for Andrea at the end. And beyond that, also, we have the fact that she wasted these opportunities to potentially flip the game of Boss Rob. Now, in reality, do I think she should have flipped the Zapatero at the merge? I don't know. I think even that's a very precarious spot, obviously. But the fact that she never really seemed to have this plan to flip the game on Boston Rob at any point is pretty ridiculous to me. So I do feel like Andrea's game is a very tough one to assess, when I just don't genuinely see a way for her to win unless she's at the end against Natalie and Phillip, which was probably never going to happen anyway. So it's a tough game to assess for me. However, I do feel like the fact that she lasted as long as she did without being voted out is enough to land her here at number 5. Now number 4, and funnily the top 4 here are the 2 returnees from 2 specific seasons. But at number 4, we're starting it off with a player that, in my opinion, their game has gone down significantly by latest rewatch of their season, though is still a good player nonetheless, and that person is Burton from Survivor Pearl Islands. And Burton plays a weird game in the fact that he is essentially voted out the first opportunity, a vote out where he throws the immunity challenge, and they take out the strongest guy on the tribe there, something that is pretty unpredictable, but still, like, overall, like, that is a bad knock against him, though I do think once he returns to the game, I think he plays pretty well. He's able to reintegrate within the Drake tribe, gain the trust of everybody there, while also flip over Lil at the merge to keep her as a number, while also working alongside Fairplay and navigating through the merge, flipping back and forth. They got the likes of a Rupert, a Tawana, and then a Krista. However, he obviously plays his boot round very poorly. He makes it very clear to the women that him and Fairplay are running things and that they're going to take each other to the final 2. He completely burns his relationship with Lil, which is all really bad. But again, I do think he pretty much runs the early merge portion of the game alongside Jon, though I do think Jon was a lot more integral to the decisions that they end up making as a group, along with the fact that I do feel like Burton makes some suboptimal plays along the way, particularly in his threat management, with him getting rid of the likes of Rupert and Rhino, which really made him stand out even more. So I do think on paper he does have a relatively impressive game, running the game alongside Jon for the middle portion of it. I do disagree with his decision making throughout it. That leaves him here at number 4. Now number 3, and here we're moving on to the highest placing player on the list, and here we do have Chris Underwood. And Chris Underwood, again, also has a very tough game to assess, largely because he was voted out at the 3rd tribal of the season and comes back at the final 6 to then win the game in a position where he needed an idol at the final 5, and also at the final 4, he essentially needs someone to beat Rick Devins in fire. And while he was obviously very successful in doing so, it's still a bit of a rocky situation there. Like, I do feel like Chris Underwood's game is obviously not hard to assess amongst other winners, as he's obviously on the bottom, but amongst people that were also voted out, and in a situation where he's actually the top placing person amongst these people, it is a bit more tough. Because even with the next few people that we'll be talking about that all got voted out in a similar place as him, they all end up returning to the game at the merge, had more game to play than Chris, who literally returns at the end game with an idol essentially being handed to him for the final 5 round. And again, I just feel like, well, yes, Chris does survive a few rounds early on. Again, he does survive the Ream vote and the Keith vote. The Keith vote in particular is one that he takes away one of his own numbers, which allowed for the opportunity for him to be voted out at the 3rd round. Though at the same time, his actual vote out is a pretty rocky one, where it is one where the decision that David and Rick make to take him out there is largely based around the fact that they think that a swap is coming, and through that do not need to keep him around as a shield for that, which is ironic considering what later happens to them. And in direct comparison to Burton, and while Burton does run a lot more of the game than Chris ever did, I do still look at them as very similar players. I think when comparing their early game, I think Chris's game was more impressive to me than Burton's, where Burton was kind of on the outs on the original Drake tribe from the offset, while Chris was in a power position initially and then kind of squandered that. Oh, I still feel like I had to leave Chris behind here at number 3, even though he does obviously win the game, just because, like, while I do think how he wins the game with those final 3 rounds is pretty impressive, and how he pulls each of those moves off, it's also still a situation that was pretty luck dependent, and he just plays less of the game than the next 2 that we'll be talking about, and because of that, for me, Chris is here at number 3. Now, number 2, the other person from Survivor Pearl Islands, we do have Lil, and I will say there was actually a point where Lil was number 1 on this list, which would have been really disturbing, but Lil just plays a weird game, because she's someone that isn't entirely bad in the pre-merge. I mean, she does survive a few rounds before being taken out. I mean, she attends 3 tribals in the pre-merge and survives the likes of a Nicole and a Skinny Ryan, and when she returns to the merge, again, I do think she makes the right call for her game and flipping against Savage, taking him out, and then again, probably navigates through the game in her best possible scenario, working alongside Burton in a situation where the only chance that she would have at winning the game would be against Burton due to this anti-returnee sentiment. Now, at the end of the day, I don't even think she beats Burton, but she is technically playing for her best interests. However, how much of that is active? And that is the big thing, because, like, technically, I think she navigates through the game as she should. Where while, again, taking out Burton becomes a bit of a questionable move, she's also in a position at that point where Burton's coming after her, which is also a questionable move from him. And beyond that, I do think she makes the optimal move in taking out Dara at 4, someone that wasn't going to take her to the end, and then gets to a final 3 where she's essentially guaranteed final 2. However, again, I don't know how much of this was active. I feel like a lot of this was her playing emotionally. Her, again, just attaching herself to Burton initially and just doing whatever he said, and then she's manipulated by Jon into taking out Dara, even though, again, that was probably better for her game. And then her final decision, voting out Jon, felt like a decision more so made because of outside of the game implications than in game. And I just feel like overall, I just don't think Lil played the game that strategically. Now, again, it is still effective in the fact that once she returns, she does navigate all the way to the end, and that is why she is higher on this list. But again, it's the complete lack of win equity, even against her best case scenario in Burton, that did make me decide to leave her off the number 1 spot and put her at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player to be voted out and then return to the game is Rick Devins. And Rick Devins has a game that obviously I've been critical of. I do think if Rick Devins had won the game on Edge of Extinction, he would still be the worst winner, just barely being better than Chris in my eyes. However, I think when truly analyzing his game's not entirely bad until like the very, very end, where essentially him and David are in these swing positions for the early game. And again, they base a lot of their decisions around this concept of the fact that they're going to swap, that they don't need to worry about the fact that they are next on the pecking order because they're more than likely going to swap and everything's going to be fine. So instead, they decide to keep with tribe loyalty, sticking with Lauren, Wardog, and Kelly. However, then they get swap screwed. And people say that this isn't swap screwed because, oh, you're just getting screwed into the same tribe, because that's essentially what happened. However, it is screwed because obviously they were banking on the fact that they wouldn't be swapped into the same tribe. And it's almost never happened before in Survivor history where you swapped into the same tribe. Like, it's very improbable that this would happen. And he does get taken out in the following round there. But again, I very much look at that as a swap screwed situation. However, he does come back. And again, his game's a bit rocky still. But I still think, like, again, he sides with the commas. They do seem to want to bring him along for a bit. He's a part of certain blind sides. Then he's one of the main orchestrators of the Julia vote. However, after that, obviously his game does start to crumble. He loses David. He needs to win challenges and play idols to get his way to the end. However, he still almost does that. He gets himself to a final 4 where we have forced fire making in a position where he probably beats anybody in fire outside of Chris. Essentially a situation where the Edge of Extinction, despite it saving him earlier, it then ends up screwing him over, as the return of Chris and Chris facing him in fire essentially causes the end of his game. But in many ways, he probably should have won that season, where had it not been for a second Edge returnee, he more likely does win, getting to the end and wins an almost unanimous vote. So again, it is a bit of a rocky game here, and I think in comparison to all these people that were voted out and came back into the game, I think the fact that he had such massive win equity at the end, like an Ozzy, but also just got a decent amount of unlucky breaks to kind of lessen the impact of all the lucky breaks that he ended up getting, while also still having at least a few rounds where he was kind of controlling things. For me, it's good enough to land him here at number 1. But there we go, and that's the ranking of every Survivor player that was voted out and came back to the game. As we move forward, stay tuned for more videos like this, more Survivor Big Brother videos. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.